The scream tore through the afternoon air like a jagged blade, cutting across the dusty main street of El Dorado Canyon, Nevada. And Graham Ryder felt his blood run cold before he even turned his head. He had been leading his weary horse toward the livery stable, bone-tired after 3 weeks of trailing cattle through the unforgiving desert, when that sound reached him, and every instinct in his body told him something was terribly wrong. The year was 1882, and this mining town had seen its share of trouble, but there was something about that particular cry that made his jaw clench and his hand instinctively drop to the worn grip of his Colt revolver. He spun around, his spurs jangling against the wooden planks of the boardwalk, and his eyes immediately found the source of the commotion. Outside the Silver Dollar Saloon, a young woman with copper-colored hair was struggling against 2 men who gripped her arms with brutal efficiency, dragging her toward a black carriage that waited like some predatory bird in the street. Her calico dress was torn at the shoulder, and even from this distance, Graham could see the terror etched across her delicate features. Standing beside the carriage was an older man, perhaps in his late 50s, dressed in an expensive suit that looked absurdly out of place in this rough town, his silver beard neatly trimmed, and his cold eyes watching the scene with the detached interest of someone inspecting livestock. Graham did not hesitate. His boots hit the dirt street at a run, covering the 100 yards between them in seconds that felt like hours. As he approached, he could hear the woman's voice, hoarse from screaming but still fighting with every fiber of her being. "I will not marry you. I do not care what my father owed you. I am not property." The older man's lips curved into something that might have been mistaken for a smile by someone who had never seen genuine human warmth. "Your father's debts are considerable, Miss Vance. $20,000 is not an insignificant sum. This arrangement benefits us both. You will have a comfortable life, and I will have a young wife to tend my home in San Francisco." "Over my dead body," the woman spat, and Graham felt a surge of admiration for her courage even as he closed the distance between them. One of the hired men, a thick-necked brute with a scar running down his left cheek, noticed Graham's approach and released the woman's arm to reach for his own weapon. That was his mistake. Graham's fist connected with the man's jaw with the full force of 3 weeks of pent-up frustration and righteous anger, sending him sprawling into the dust. The second man, smaller but wiry, made the error of maintaining his grip on the woman, which meant he could not defend himself when Graham's boot caught him in the ribs with enough force to knock the wind from his lungs. The young woman stumbled backward, free but off balance, and Graham caught her elbow to steady her. For a moment, their eyes met, and he found himself staring into the most striking green eyes he had ever seen, bright with unshed tears and fierce determination. She could not have been more than 22 or 23, with a heart-shaped face dusted with freckles and lips that were pressed into a thin line of defiance. "Are you all right, miss?" Graham asked, his voice rougher than he intended. Before she could answer, the older man stepped forward, his face flushed with indignation. "See here, you have no right to interfere in private business. I am Horace Pemberton, and this young woman is my betrothed. Her father signed a contract." Graham positioned himself between Pemberton and the woman, his tall frame casting a shadow across the older man's expensive suit. "I do not care if you are the president himself. I heard what she said, and it sounds to me like the lady is not willing." "The lady has no choice in the matter," Pemberton said coldly. "Her father died 3 months ago, leaving her destitute and in considerable debt to me. I have been generous enough to offer marriage rather than demanding immediate payment. She should be grateful." By this time, a crowd had gathered on the boardwalk, drawn by the commotion. Graham could feel their eyes on him, measuring, judging. He knew he was about to make a decision that would change everything. But when he glanced back at the young woman and saw the desperate hope flickering in her eyes, the choice became remarkably simple. "She will be leaving here with me," Graham said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent street. "And if you or your hired men try to stop us, I promise you will regret it." Pemberton's face turned an alarming shade of purple. "This is preposterous. You cannot simply abduct another man's fiancée." "I am not his fiancée," the woman said, her voice stronger now that she had found an ally. "I never agreed to this arrangement. He is trying to force me into marriage to cover my father's gambling debts." Graham's hand remained steady on his revolver. "Sounds like kidnapping to me. Now, I suggest you and your men get back in that fancy carriage and head back to wherever you came from before I decide to involve the sheriff." One of the hired men, the one Graham had punched, was climbing to his feet with blood dripping from his split lip. "You are going to pay for this, Cowboy." "Maybe," Graham agreed, "but not today." For a long moment, Pemberton stared at Graham with undisguised hatred, calculating odds and possibilities. Finally, he gestured sharply to his men. "This is not over, Miss Vance. I have legal documentation of your father's debts. I will return with the proper authorities, and you will fulfill the terms of our agreement." "I look forward to that conversation," Graham said, "because I am fairly certain that forcing a woman into marriage against her will is illegal, no matter how much money her father owed you." Pemberton climbed into his carriage with stiff dignity, followed by his two bruised employees. As the vehicle pulled away, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake, Graham felt the tension slowly drain from his shoulders. The crowd on the boardwalk began to disperse, though he caught more than a few curious glances directed his way and whispered conversations that would no doubt fuel gossip for weeks to come. He turned back to the young woman, who was watching him with an expression that mixed gratitude, confusion, and something else he could not quite identify. Up close, he could see that she was trembling, though whether from fear or the aftermath of adrenaline, he could not be certain. "Thank you," she said softly. "I do not even know your name, and you just risked your life for me." "Graham Ryder," he said, removing his dusty hat in a gesture his mother would have been proud of, "and I would not say I risked my life. Men like that are usually cowards when faced with actual resistance." "Olivia Vance," she replied, and attempted a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Though I suppose you already knew that from listening to Mr. Pemberton's charming speech. Where are your people, Miss Vance? Surely you have someone in this town who can help you." The smile faded entirely. "I have no one. My mother died when I was a child, and my father passed away 3 months ago. He had been working a silver claim outside of town. But when he died, I discovered that he had gambled away everything we owned and had borrowed heavily from Pemberton to cover his losses. I have been working as a seamstress, trying to earn enough to leave town, but Pemberton found me 2 days ago and informed me that I had 1 week to agree to marriage, or he would have me arrested for theft of his property." "Theft of his property? That makes no sense." "He claimed that since I owed him money, anything I earned through my labor was rightfully his until the debt was paid. I do not know if that is actually legal, but I do not have money for a lawyer to find out." She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly looking very young and very vulnerable. "I had almost saved enough for a stagecoach ticket to Denver, where I have a cousin who might take me in. But Pemberton must have gotten wind of my plans because he came with those men today to force the issue." Graham studied her for a moment, his mind working through possibilities. He had come to El Dorado Canyon to collect his pay from the cattle drive, and then head back to his small ranch about 30 miles north, near the Spring Mountains. It was not much, just a modest spread with a cabin, a barn, and enough land to run a small herd, but it was his, and he had worked himself to the bone for 3 years to build it up. He had no intention of getting entangled in someone else's problems, especially problems involving wealthy men with lawyers and legal contracts. But when he looked at Olivia Vance, with her copper hair gleaming in the afternoon sun and her green eyes still bright with unshed tears, he found himself saying, "How much do you owe him?" $20,000. The number came out as a whisper. It might as well be $1 million. I could work for 20 years and never earn that much. Graham let out a low whistle. That was indeed a considerable sum. And you are certain your father actually borrowed that amount from him? I do not know, Olivia admitted. I never saw any paperwork. My father and I were not close toward the end. He had become consumed by his gambling, always certain that the next card game would make his fortune. I knew he was losing money, but I had no idea how bad it had gotten until after he died and Pemberton appeared with his claims. Then the first thing we need to do is verify whether this debt actually exists, Graham said. And if it does, we need to determine whether it can legally be transferred to you. I am no lawyer, but I have heard of cases where children are not held responsible for their parents' debts. Olivia repeated, and for the first time, a hint of genuine hope appeared in her expression. You would help me further. You have already done so much. Graham should have said no. He should have tipped his hat, wished her well, and ridden back to his ranch to live his simple, uncomplicated life. But he had always been cursed with a stubborn sense of justice and an inability to walk away from someone in need. His mother used to say it would get him killed someday. He hoped today was not that day. I reckon I started something when I punched that fellow in the face, Graham said. Seems only right that I see it through. Besides, I do not trust Pemberton as far as I could throw him, and I would wager good money that his legal claim is not as solid as he wants you to believe. Tears spilled over Olivia's cheeks then, though she tried to brush them away with the back of her hand. I cannot pay you. I have less than $50 to my name. I did not ask for payment, Graham said gruffly, uncomfortable with her gratitude. Come on. Let us get you somewhere safe while we figure this out. Do you have a place to stay? I have been renting a room above the general store, but the landlord told me yesterday that Pemberton bought the building. I have until tomorrow to vacate. Of course he did, Graham muttered. Pemberton was clearly a man who believed money could solve any problem and buy any person. The thought made Graham's anger flare again. All right, then. We will get your things from the general store and you can stay at the boarding house on the edge of town. I know the owner, a widow named Mrs. Patterson. She is good people and will not be intimidated by Pemberton. They walked together down the dusty street, Graham leading his horse and Olivia at his side, acutely aware of the eyes that followed their progress. By nightfall, everyone in El Dorado Canyon would be talking about the cowboy who had stood up to Horace Pemberton and claimed the young seamstress as his own. The thought made Graham's collar feel tight, but he pushed the discomfort aside. He had made his choice, and he would live with the consequences. The general store was cool and dim after the brightness of the street, smelling of flour and coffee, and the distinctive tang of pickled goods. The proprietor, a nervous man named Johnson, eyed them both with obvious anxiety. Miss Vance, I heard about the trouble in the street, he said, wringing his hands. I want you to know I had no choice about selling the building. Mr. Pemberton made me an offer I could not refuse. I understand, Mr. Johnson, Olivia said quietly. I just need to collect my belongings from my room. Of course. Take your time. Graham waited by the counter while Olivia disappeared up the narrow staircase that led to the rooms above the store. Johnson busied himself with rearranging cans on a shelf, clearly uncomfortable with the silence. "Pemberton is a powerful man," Johnson finally said, not looking at Graham. "He owns the bank in Carson City and has connections all over Nevada." "You might have bitten off more than you can chew, Mr. Ryder." "Then I reckon I will have to chew harder," Graham replied evenly. Olivia returned a few minutes later carrying a single carpet bag that looked like it contained everything she owned in the world. The sight of it made something twist in Graham's chest. She was so young, so alone, with nothing but that one bag and the dress on her back, fighting against a man who probably spent more on his morning coffee than she earned in a month. They made their way to the boarding house, a whitewashed two-story structure with a porch that wrapped around the front and side. Mrs. Patterson, a handsome woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes, listened to their story with increasing indignation. "That scoundrel," she declared when Graham finished explaining the situation. "I never did trust that Pemberton. He has been buying up property all over town, forcing good people out of their homes and businesses. Of course you can stay here, dear," she said to Olivia. "And I will not charge you a cent until you are back on your feet. Any enemy of Horace Pemberton is a friend of mine." "I cannot accept charity," Olivia protested weakly. "It is not charity, it is good business," Mrs. Patterson said firmly. "I have been needing someone with sewing skills to help me with mending and alterations for my boarders. You can work in exchange for your room and board. How does that sound?" Olivia looked like she wanted to cry again. "That sounds more than fair. Thank you, Mrs. Patterson." After getting Olivia settled into a small but clean room on the second floor, Graham excused himself and headed to the sheriff's office, a squat adobe building at the far end of town. Sheriff Tom Brennan was a weathered man in his late 40s who had been keeping the peace in El Dorado Canyon for nearly a decade. He listened to Graham's account of the afternoon's events while cleaning his rifle, his expression neutral. "Pemberton reported the incident already," Brennan said when Graham finished. "According to him, you assaulted his employees and aided a debtor in evading her legal obligations. And what did you tell him?" "I told him I would investigate the matter thoroughly," Brennan said, setting down his rifle and meeting Graham's eyes. "Between you and me, I do not like Pemberton any more than Mrs. Patterson does. But the law is the law, and if he has legitimate documentation showing that Olivia Vance owes him money, my hands are tied." "Can you at least verify whether his claim is legitimate?" Graham asked. "Olivia never saw any paperwork. For all we know, he is inventing this debt out of whole cloth." "I can try," Brennan agreed. "But Pemberton is smart. If he is making this claim, he probably has something to back it up, even if it is not entirely above board. Men like him do not get rich by being careless with their lives." Graham thanked the sheriff and left, feeling the weight of the situation settling onto his shoulders. As he walked back toward the boarding house in the gathering dusk, he tried to understand what he had gotten himself into, and why he felt so compelled to help this young woman he had only just met. Olivia was sitting on the porch when he returned, her copper hair loose around her shoulders, and her face turned toward the purple sky where the first stars were beginning to appear. She looked up when she heard his footsteps, and even in the fading light he could see the exhaustion in her features. "Did you speak with the sheriff?" she asked. "I did. He is going to look into Pemberton's claims, but he warned me that if the debt is legitimate, the law will be on Pemberton's side." Graham settled himself on the porch railing, keeping a respectful distance. "Tell me about your father. Was he the type of man who would borrow that much money?" Olivia was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands folded in her lap. "My father was a dreamer," she finally said. "When my mother died, something broke inside him. He started prospecting, convinced he would find the mother lode that would make us rich. When that did not work, he turned to gambling. He always believed his luck was about to turn, that the next game would be the one that changed everything." Her voice cracked slightly. "I tried to help him, to make him see reason, but he would not listen to me. Toward the end, he barely spoke to me at all except to ask for money for his next stake." "I am sorry," Graham said quietly. "That must have been hard." "The worst part is that I am angry at him," Olivia said, tears streaming down her face now. "He is dead, and instead of mourning him, I am angry that he left me in this situation." "What kind of daughter does that make me?" "It makes you human," Graham said. He wanted to reach out and comfort her, but he kept his hands firmly on the porch railing. "You have every right to be angry. Your father put his own desires ahead of your well-being, and now you are paying the price for his choices." "And now you are paying the price too," Olivia said, wiping at her tears. "You should not have gotten involved, Mr. Ryder. Pemberton will make trouble for you because of what you did today." "Let him try," Graham said. "I have faced worse than a wealthy banker with delusions of grandeur." Despite everything, Olivia laughed, a sound like water over stones. "You are either very brave or very foolish." "Probably a bit of both," Graham admitted with a slight grin. "My mother used to say I had more courage than sense." "Used to say? Is she no longer living?" "She died 5 years ago. Fever took her during a hard winter. My father passed when I was 16, thrown from a horse." Graham surprised himself by sharing these details. He was not usually one for talking about personal matters. "It is just me now. Me and my ranch and a stubborn mule named Chester who thinks he runs the place. You have a ranch near here, about 30 miles north in the foothills. It is not much, but it is mine. I have been building it up slowly, running cattle and breaking horses." He looked out at the darkening desert. "It is a good life, quiet, honest work." "It sounds wonderful," Olivia said wistfully. "I have lived in mining towns my whole life, following my father from claim to claim. I have always wondered what it would be like to have a real home, a place that stays still long enough to put down roots." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars multiplied overhead, and the sounds of the town settled into evening rhythms. Graham found himself thinking that he could get used to this, sitting with Olivia and talking about everything and nothing. The thought startled him. He had only known this woman for a few hours, and already he was imagining a future that included her presence. Over the next 3 days, Graham stayed in El Dorado Canyon, taking a room at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house and helping Olivia settle into her new routine. She proved to be an excellent seamstress, and word of her skills quickly spread through the town. Women began appearing at the boarding house with mending and alteration work, and Mrs. Patterson was delighted with the extra business. Graham spent his time making inquiries about Pemberton and his business dealings. What he discovered did not surprise him, but did anger him. Pemberton had made his fortune through questionable loans and ruthless collection practices. He had a reputation for targeting vulnerable people, offering them money when they were desperate, and then using that debt to acquire their property or labor at a fraction of their true value. Several people Graham spoke with had stories of friends or relatives who had been ruined by Pemberton's schemes. On the 4th day, Sheriff Brennan summoned Graham and Olivia to his office. Pemberton was already there, seated in a leather chair and looking supremely confident. He did not stand when they entered, a calculated insult that made Graham's jaw tighten. "Thank you for coming," Brennan said, gesturing for them to sit. "Mr. Pemberton has provided documentation regarding the debt in question. I have reviewed it, and I wanted you both to see it as well." He pushed a stack of papers across his desk. Graham picked them up and began reading, his heart sinking with each line. The documents appeared legitimate, a series of promissory notes signed by Olivia's father, totaling just over $20,000. The loans had been made over the course of 2 years, each one carrying an interest rate of 15% compounded monthly. "These dates," Graham said, pointing to the papers. "The first loan was made 3 years ago." "That is correct," Pemberton said smoothly. "Joseph Vance approached me for financial assistance to fund his mining operations. I was generous enough to provide it." "At 15% interest compounded monthly," Graham said. "Do you have any idea how predatory that is?" "It is well within legal limits for Nevada territory," Pemberton replied. "Your personal opinions on fair lending practices are irrelevant." Graham turned to Olivia, who had gone pale. "Did you know your father had borrowed this much?" "No," she whispered. "He never told me." "I knew he was borrowing money, but I thought it was just a few $100s here and there from other miners." "Regardless of what Miss Vance knew or did not know, the debt exists and is legally binding," Pemberton said. "Under Nevada law, the debts of a deceased person transfer to their heirs. Since Miss Vance is Joseph's only living relative, she is responsible for repayment. Or she can accept your generous offer of marriage," Graham said bitterly. "I have offered to forgive the entire debt in exchange for marriage," Pemberton confirmed. "It is an extraordinarily generous arrangement. Miss Vance would want for nothing as my wife." "Except freedom and dignity," Olivia said, finding her voice. "I would rather work for the rest of my life to pay back every penny than marry a man I do not love." Pemberton's expression hardened. "Then you will work for the rest of your life." "With the compounding interest, the debt now totals nearly $28,000. At your current earnings as a seamstress, you will never pay even a fraction of that amount." "There has to be another way," Graham said, looking at Sheriff Brennan. "This cannot be legal." "Unfortunately, it is," Brennan said, his tone sympathetic. "I have verified the documents with a lawyer in Carson City. The promissory notes are legitimate, signed by Joseph Vance. The interest rate, while high, does not exceed legal limits. And Nevada law does hold heirs responsible for the debts of deceased relatives when there is an estate to settle." "But Olivia has no estate," Graham protested. "Her father died with nothing." "The law does not differentiate," Brennan said. "I am sorry, Miss Vance, but unless you can pay the debt or reach some other agreement with Mr. Pemberton, he has the legal right to garnish your wages until the debt is satisfied." Pemberton stood, smoothing his expensive coat. "My offer of marriage stands, Miss Vance. I will give you until the end of the week to reconsider. After that, I will begin collection proceedings." He paused at the door, looking back at Graham. "And I would advise you, Mr. Ryder, to stay out of matters that do not concern you. I have influential friends, and I do not appreciate interference in my business affairs." After Pemberton left, Graham sat in stunned silence, trying to process what had just happened. Beside him, Olivia was crying silently, tears streaming down her face. "I cannot marry him," she said. "I cannot. I would rather die." "You are not going to die, and you are not going to marry him," Graham said firmly. "There has to be a solution. We just need to think." "What is there to think about?" Olivia said hopelessly. "He has won. The law is on his side." Graham stood abruptly, pacing the small office. "How much money do you have saved?" $47.30. "And I have about $300 from my cattle drive earnings." Graham's mind was racing, calculating possibilities. What if we contested the debt? "Hired a lawyer to examine those documents more carefully." "Lawyers are expensive," Brennan said gently. "You would spend everything you have just for a consultation, and there is no guarantee they could find anything wrong with Pemberton's claim." "Then, what do you suggest?" Graham demanded, frustrated by his own helplessness. Brennan was quiet for a moment, then cleared his throat. There is one possibility. If Miss Vance were married to someone else, her husband would assume responsibility for her debts. But he could negotiate different terms with Pemberton, potentially more favorable ones, and Pemberton would lose his leverage of forcing marriage. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Graham turned to look at Olivia, who was staring at the sheriff with wide eyes. "You are suggesting a marriage of convenience," Graham said slowly. "I am suggesting nothing," Brennan said carefully. "I am merely stating facts about how the law works. What you do with that information is your own business." The walk back to the boarding house was silent. Graham's thoughts were churning, examining the suggestion from every angle. Marriage. It was absurd. He barely knew Olivia Vance. They had met less than a week ago. And yet, the more he thought about it, the more sense it made in a strange, desperate sort of way. That evening, Graham found Olivia sitting in the parlor of the boarding house, mending a shirt by lamplight. Mrs. Patterson had discreetly retired to her own quarters, leaving them alone. Graham settled into the chair across from her, watching her nimble fingers work the needle through fabric. "We should talk about what the sheriff suggested," he finally said, Olivia's hands stilled. "It is too much to ask. You have already done so much for me. I cannot expect you to marry me just to save me from Pemberton." "What if it was not just to save you from Pemberton?" Graham said. "What if it made sense for both of us?" She looked up at him, confusion evident in her green eyes. "How could it possibly make sense for you?" "I have a ranch that needs a woman's touch," Graham said. "I am not good at cooking or mending or keeping house. I spend all my time working the land and the animals, and the cabin is falling apart because I do not have time to properly maintain it. I could use a partner." "You could hire someone for that," Olivia pointed out. "You do not need to marry me." "Maybe I want to," Graham said, and was surprised to realize he meant it. Over the past few days, he had come to admire Olivia's strength and resilience. She was intelligent, hardworking, and possessed a quiet dignity that appealed to him. More than that, he enjoyed her company in a way he had not enjoyed anyone's company in years. "I am 32 years old, and I have been alone for too long. I have been telling myself I am too busy building the ranch to think about marriage, but the truth is I have been lonely." Olivia set down her mending, her hands trembling slightly. "Graham, you do not have to say these things to make me feel better about accepting your help." "I am not saying them to make you feel better," Graham said. "I am saying them because they are true. Look, I am not proposing some grand romance. I know you do not love me, and I am not fool enough to claim I love you after knowing you for less than a week. But I like you, Olivia. I respect you, and I think we could build a good life together if we were both willing to try." "And what about Pemberton? He would still have legal claim to the debt." "If you were my wife, I would handle Pemberton," Graham said. "I have some savings beyond what I am carrying. I could offer him partial payment and negotiate terms for the rest. It would not be easy and it might take years to pay off completely, but we could do it together. And most importantly, he would have no power over you anymore." Olivia stood and walked to the window, looking out at the dark street. "You would really do this for me? Tie yourself to a woman you barely know, take on a crushing debt, all to save me from a forced marriage." Graham joined her at the window. "I would do it for you, but I would also do it for me. Like I said, I have been lonely, and I think you and I could be good for each other." She turned to face him, and in the lamplight her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I do not know what to say. Say yes," Graham said simply, "or say no, but either way give me an honest answer." Olivia studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to read his soul through his eyes. Finally, she took a deep breath. "Yes, but I have conditions." "Name them." "I will not be a burden," she said firmly. "I will work as hard as any ranch hand. I will earn my keep and contribute to paying off this debt. And I will not expect you to treat me as a real wife unless and until we both decide that is what we want. This will be a partnership, not a prison sentence." Graham felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he had not realized he was carrying. "That sounds more than fair. I promise I will treat you with respect and give you space to figure out what you want from this arrangement. And if the day comes when you want to leave, I will not stop you." "I doubt that day will come," Olivia said softly. "I am not in the habit of abandoning people who have shown me kindness." They were married 2 days later in a simple ceremony at the small church on the edge of town. Mrs. Patterson served as a witness, along with Sheriff Brennan, who looked relieved that a peaceful solution had been found. Olivia wore a simple blue dress she had sewn herself, and Graham wore his only suit, which smelled faintly of cedar from the trunk where it had been stored. The ceremony was brief and businesslike, the minister clearly puzzled by the hasty nature of the union, but willing to perform his duty. When Graham slipped the simple gold band onto Olivia's finger, a band he had purchased from the jeweler that morning using half of his remaining money, she looked up at him with an expression he could not quite read. Gratitude, certainly, but also something else. Hope, perhaps. Or the beginning of trust. They did not kiss at the end of the ceremony. It felt too intimate, too presumptuous given the nature of their arrangement. Instead, Graham squeezed her hand gently, and she returned the pressure with a small smile that made his heart beat faster. The real challenge came that afternoon when they paid a visit to Horace Pemberton at his hotel. The older man's face went through a remarkable range of emotions when Graham announced that he and Olivia had married that morning, settling finally on barely controlled fury. "You think you are clever," Pemberton said coldly, "but the debt still exists. Now it is your responsibility, Mr. Ryder. I hope you understand what you have taken on." "I understand perfectly," Graham said, "and I am prepared to make you an offer. I have $2,000 in savings. I can give you that amount immediately as a down payment. For the remainder, I propose monthly payments of $100 until the debt is satisfied. At that rate, it would take you 20 years to pay off what is owed, even without considering the compounding interest," Pemberton said. "Then we will negotiate a fixed interest rate instead of compounding," Graham countered. 3% annually, which is more than fair for a secured debt." "Secured by what? A failing ranch and a seamstress wife." Graham's hands clenched into fists, but he kept his voice level. "Secured by my word and my willingness to honor this debt, even though I question its legitimacy. You can accept my offer, or you can try to collect through the courts, which will cost you time and legal fees with no guarantee of success. I am offering you a path to getting your money back. That is more than you deserve, given how you acquired this debt in the first place." Pemberton was silent for a long moment, his shrewd eyes calculating. Finally, he nodded curtly. "Very well. I will accept your terms on one condition. If you miss a single payment, the entire remaining balance becomes due immediately, and I will file for seizure of your ranch and all assets." "Agreed," Graham said before Olivia could protest. "Draw up the papers and I will sign them." They left Pemberton's hotel an hour later with a legally binding agreement that felt like a weight settling onto Graham's shoulders. $2,000 gone from his savings, plus $100 every month for years to come. It would mean sacrifices. No new equipment for the ranch. No hired hands to help with the work. Every penny they earned would go toward survival and that monthly payment. But when he looked at Olivia walking beside him, her chin held high despite everything they faced, he knew he had made the right choice. The journey to Graham's ranch took most of the following day. They traveled in a wagon Graham had borrowed from Mrs. Patterson, loaded with Olivia's few possessions and supplies Graham had purchased in town. The landscape was harsh but beautiful, all red rock and scrubby desert plants, with the spring mountains rising in the distance like a promise of cooler air and green things. Olivia was quiet for much of the journey, her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on the horizon. Graham respected her silence, understanding that she was processing everything that had happened in the past week. Her entire life had been upended, and now she was heading into an unknown future with a man who was essentially a stranger. As the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, they crested a rise, and Graham's ranch came into view. He saw it through Olivia's eyes and felt a flash of embarrassment. The cabin was small and weathered, in desperate need of fresh paint and several missing shingles on the roof. The barn was in better shape, at least, and the corral held 3 horses and Chester the mule, who brayed indignantly at their approach. "It is not much," Graham said, suddenly nervous, "but it is sturdy and the well water is good." "It is beautiful," Olivia said, and to his surprise she sounded like she meant it. "I can see all the work you have put into it. The land is good and the location is perfect, protected from the worst of the wind by those rocks." They unloaded the wagon as the sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. Inside, the cabin was exactly as Graham had described, sparse and functional but clean. There was a main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen area with a cast iron stove, and 2 small bedrooms separated by thin wooden walls. "You take the larger bedroom," Graham said, carrying Olivia's carpetbag to the room on the left. "I will sleep in the other one." Olivia looked like she wanted to argue but simply nodded. "Thank you, Graham, for everything." That first night set the pattern for the weeks that followed. They fell into a routine born of necessity and mutual respect. Graham rose before dawn to tend the animals and work the land, while Olivia took over the household duties, cooking meals that were substantially better than anything Graham had ever made for himself, mending clothes, and slowly transforming the cabin from a bachelor's rough shelter into something that felt like a home. In the evenings, they would sit together on the porch, talking about their days and their plans for the ranch. Graham found himself sharing dreams he had never voiced aloud, about expanding the herd, building a better barn, maybe planting an orchard if they could divert water from the creek that ran along the northern edge of his property. Olivia listened with genuine interest, asking intelligent questions and offering suggestions that showed she was learning quickly about ranch life. As the weeks turned into months, something began to shift between them. The awkwardness of those first days faded, replaced by an easy companionship. Graham caught himself looking forward to meals, not just for the food but for Olivia's company. He loved the way she laughed at his terrible jokes, the way she bit her lower lip when she was concentrating on her sewing, the way she sang softly to herself while cooking. For her part, Olivia seemed to be blooming in the desert air. The shadows under her eyes faded, and color returned to her cheeks. She threw herself into ranch work with unexpected enthusiasm, learning to milk the cow Graham acquired, tending a small vegetable garden she planted near the cabin, and even helping with the horses when Graham would allow it. They made the monthly payment to Pemberton with money earned from selling cattle and horses Graham had trained. It was always tight, always a struggle, but they managed. And with each payment, with each month that passed, the partnership between them deepened into something more profound. It was a cool evening in October, nearly 5 months after their hasty wedding, when Graham realized he had fallen in love with his wife. They were working together to repair a section of fence that had been damaged by a windstorm. Olivia holding the posts steady while Graham hammered them into place. The setting sun caught her copper hair, making it glow like fire, and when she looked up at him with a smile that lit up her entire face, his heart simply gave up any pretense of indifference. He loved her. He loved her strength and her stubbornness and her quiet competence. He loved the way she had transformed his lonely cabin into a warm home. He loved her terrible singing voice and her skill with a needle, and the way she always saved him the last biscuit at dinner. He loved everything about her, and the realization hit him with the force of a runaway horse. Graham. Olivia's voice broke through his reverie. "Are you all right? You look strange." "I am fine," he managed to say, though his voice sounded odd even to his own ears. "Just thinking." About what? He could have deflected, changed the subject, kept his feelings hidden. But they had built their marriage on honesty, and he would not start lying now. "About how lucky I am." Olivia tilted her head, studying him with those perceptive green eyes. "Lucky how?" "Lucky that I happened to be in El Dorado Canyon that day," Graham said, setting down his hammer. "Lucky that I heard you scream. Lucky that you agreed to marry me. Lucky that I get to spend my days working beside you and my evenings talking with you. Just lucky." Something flickered in Olivia's expression, a softness that made his breath catch. "I am the lucky one," she said quietly. "You saved my life, Graham. You gave me a home and a future when I had nothing. You treat me with more respect and kindness than I ever thought possible from a man. I do not know how I will ever repay you." "You do not need to repay me," Graham said. "Having you here, that is payment enough." They stood there in the fading light, the hammer forgotten, the fence half repaired. The space between them seemed charged with unspoken possibilities. Graham wanted to close that distance, to pull her into his arms and kiss her the way he had been dreaming about for weeks. But he had promised her space, promised not to pressure her, and he would keep that promise even if it killed him. It was Olivia who moved first, stepping closer and reaching up to touch his face with her work-roughened hand. "Graham," she said softly, "I think I need to tell you something." "What is it?" "I am not sure when it happened," she said, her eyes searching his. "Maybe it was when you first stood up to Pemberton. Maybe it was when you offered to marry me even though it made no practical sense. Maybe it was watching you work yourself to exhaustion every day to make this ranch successful. Or maybe it was 1,000 small moments, every kindness you have shown me, every time you made me laugh when I wanted to cry. But somewhere along the way, this stopped being a marriage of convenience for me." Graham's heart was pounding so hard he was certain she must be able to hear it. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that I have fallen in love with you," Olivia said, tears streaming down her face now. "I have tried to ignore it because I did not want to complicate our arrangement or make you feel obligated, but I cannot keep it inside anymore. I love you, Graham Ryder. I love your kindness and your strength and your terrible coffee, and the way you always check the barn one more time before bed even though you know everything is fine. I love everything about you, and I am sorry if that makes things complicated." Graham let out a breath he had not realized he was holding and pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest. "Complicated? Olivia, I have been in love with you for months. I have been trying so hard to respect our agreement and give you space, but every day it gets harder not to tell you how I feel." She pulled back just enough to look up at him, her face radiant with joy and relief. "Really? You love me?" "More than I thought it was possible to love anyone," Graham said. And then he was kissing her finally, desperately, pouring months of pent-up emotion into that kiss. She kissed him back with equal fervor, her arms wrapping around his neck and her fingers threading through his hair. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and slightly dizzy, Graham rested his forehead against hers. "I know our marriage started as a practical arrangement," he said, "but I want it to be real now. I want you to be my wife in every sense of the word. I want to build a life with you, have children with you, grow old with you, if that is what you want too." "It is exactly what I want," Olivia said, laughing and crying at the same time. "I want all of it, everything, with you." They walked back to the cabin hand in hand, as the stars began to appear overhead. That night, Graham moved his belongings into the larger bedroom, and they began their marriage anew, not as strangers bound by legal necessity, but as two people who had chosen each other freely and loved each other deeply. The following months brought both challenges and joys. The ranch prospered under their combined efforts. Olivia's vegetable garden expanded, providing fresh produce they could sell in town along with Graham's cattle and horses. She also continued her sewing work, taking on commissions from women in El Dorado Canyon and nearby settlements, and her reputation for quality work spread throughout the region. They made every payment to Pemberton on time, though some months it required creativity and sacrifice. Graham took on occasional work as a guide for travelers passing through the territory. Olivia sold preserves and baked goods at the general store. They pooled every penny and managed to survive. In the spring, nearly a year after their wedding, Olivia discovered she was pregnant. Graham received the news with a mixture of joy and terror. A child meant another mouth to feed, more responsibility, more pressure to keep the ranch profitable and make those monthly payments. But when he looked at Olivia's glowing face and imagined a son or daughter with her green eyes and copper hair, all his fears melted away. Their son was born in December during a cold snap that had Graham frantically stoking the fire while Mrs. Patterson, who had traveled from El Dorado Canyon to serve as midwife, calmly directed the proceedings. When Graham finally got to hold his son, a red-faced, squalling bundle with a surprising amount of dark hair, he felt something fundamental shift inside him. This was his family, his wife and his child, and he would do whatever it took to protect them and provide for them. They named the boy Daniel, after Graham's father, and he became the center of their world. Olivia proved to be a natural mother, patient and loving, and Graham discovered reserves of tenderness he had not known he possessed. He would spend hours sitting by the cradle, watching his son sleep, marveling at the tiny fingers and the perfect miniature features. The years passed in a blur of hard work and small joys. Daniel grew into a sturdy, adventurous boy who loved following his father around the ranch. 2 years after Daniel's birth, Olivia gave them a daughter they named Rose, who had her mother's copper hair and her father's brown eyes. The cabin that had once seemed adequate for 2 people now burst at the seams with a family of 4, and Graham spent a summer adding 2 more rooms to give the children proper space. Slowly, steadily, they chipped away at the debt to Pemberton. 5 years after their marriage, they had paid back more than half of what was owed. 10 years after their marriage, they were in the final stretch, with less than $3,000 remaining. The ranch had become prosperous, known throughout Nevada for quality horses and cattle. Olivia's sewing business had evolved into a small mail-order operation, with women from across the territory ordering her custom garments. They made the final payment to Horace Pemberton in the spring of 1893, 11 years after that fateful day in El Dorado Canyon. Graham and Olivia traveled to Carson City together, leaving Daniel and Rose in the capable care of Mrs. Patterson. Pemberton was older now, his silver beard completely white and his movements slower, but his eyes still held that calculating coldness. "I confess, I did not believe you would see it through," Pemberton said as Graham counted out the final payment in cash on the banker's desk. I expected you to default within the first few years. Then you do not know my wife very well, Graham said. Or me, for that matter. When we make a promise, we keep it. Pemberton signed the papers declaring the debt satisfied in full, and Graham felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he had carried for over a decade. They were finally free. No more monthly payments. No more juggling funds and worrying whether they would have enough. Their home, their ranch, their future, it all belonged to them now, free and clear. As they left Pemberton's office, Olivia slipped her hand into Graham's. "It is really over," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "We did it." "We did," Graham agreed, pulling her close and kissing her thoroughly, right there on the street in Carson City, not caring who saw. "And now we get to start the next chapter of our lives without that hanging over us." They celebrated that night at a nice hotel, a luxury they had denied themselves for years. Over dinner, they talked about their plans for the ranch, for their children's education, for the future that suddenly seemed bright with possibility. "You ever regret it?" Olivia asked as they sat together on the balcony of their room, watching the moon rise over the mountains. "Taking on my father's debt, marrying me when you barely knew me. Sometimes I think about how much simpler your life would have been if you had just walked past that scene in El Dorado Canyon." Graham pulled her closer, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "I have never regretted it for a single moment. Yes, the debt was difficult, and yes, there were times when I did not know how we would make it through. But you and our children, you are the best things that ever happened to me. If I had walked past that day, I would have missed out on the greatest adventure of my life." "Even though I cannot cook bacon without burning it," Olivia teased. "Even though you cannot cook bacon without burning it," Graham confirmed with a laugh. "And even though you sing off-key and you steal all the blankets at night and you cry at the sappiest stories, I love every imperfect, wonderful thing about you." "I love you too," Olivia said, reaching up to kiss him. "Thank you for saving me that day. And thank you for building this beautiful life with me." They returned to the ranch the next day, where Daniel and Rose greeted them with enthusiastic hugs and 1,000 questions about their trip. That evening, as they all sat together around the dinner table in the cabin that had been expanded and improved over the years but still felt like home, Graham looked around at his family and felt a contentment so profound it almost hurt. Daniel, now 11 years old, was excitedly telling a story about a snake he had found near the creek. Rose, 9 and already showing signs of her mother's creative talents, was sketching pictures of horses on a piece of paper. Olivia was laughing at something Daniel said, her face radiant in the lamplight, still as beautiful to Graham as she had been that first day in El Dorado Canyon. This was what he had worked for all those years. Not just to pay off a debt or build a successful ranch, but to create this moment, this feeling, this sense of belonging and love and family. The journey had been difficult, but every struggle had been worth it to arrive at this place of peace and happiness. As the years continued to pass, the ranch prospered further. Daniel grew into a fine young man who shared his father's love of the land and his mother's business sense. Rose developed into a talented artist and seamstress, who eventually opened her own shop in El Dorado Canyon, which had grown from a rough mining town into a proper community. Graham and Olivia grew older together, their hair turning silver but their love remaining as strong as ever. They added a porch swing to the front of the cabin where they would sit together in the evenings, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, holding hands and remembering the unlikely beginning of their love story. They became pillars of the community, known for their generosity and fairness. When young couples faced difficulties, Graham and Olivia would quietly help, offering work or loans with reasonable terms, determined that no one else would face the kind of predatory practices that Horace Pemberton had employed. They had learned from their struggles, and they used those lessons to make life better for others. In 1910, they celebrated their 28th wedding anniversary with their children and grandchildren gathered around them. Daniel had married a schoolteacher and given them 3 grandchildren. Rose had married a lawyer from Carson City and had 2 children of her own. The cabin had been expanded so many times over the years that it was now a proper ranch house, large enough to accommodate the entire family when they came to visit. At the anniversary celebration, Daniel stood to make a toast. "To my parents," he said, raising his glass, "who taught me that love is not just about grand romantic gestures, but about choosing each other every single day, about working together through hardship and celebrating together in joy, about building something meaningful and lasting through dedication and partnership. Everything I know about what it means to be a good husband and father, I learned from watching you too." Graham felt tears prick his eyes as he looked at Olivia, who was crying openly. He squeezed her hand and stood, pulling her up with him. "When I met your mother," he said, addressing his children and grandchildren, "I thought I was just helping someone in trouble. I had no idea I was meeting my future, my partner, my best friend, and the love of my life. She has made every day of the past 28 years an adventure, and I look forward to whatever adventures we still have ahead of us." "Hear, hear," everyone chorused, and they drank to love and family and the future. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Graham and Olivia sat together on their porch swing, wrapped in a blanket against the cool desert night. The ranch was quiet except for the occasional sound of livestock settling in for the night and the whisper of wind through the scrub brush. "Do you remember what you said to me that first day?" Olivia asked softly. "When Pemberton was trying to force me into his carriage." "I said you would be leaving with me," Graham replied, the memory still vivid despite the passage of time. "You had no idea what you were taking on," Olivia said. "A woman with crushing debt, no prospects, and more problems than any sensible man would want to deal with." "True," Graham admitted, "but I also had no idea I was taking on the best partner a man could ask for. Someone who would work beside me through every difficulty, who would make me laugh when things were hard, who would give me children and grandchildren and a life richer than anything I could have imagined. We have built something good here, have we not?" Olivia said, looking out at the ranch that had been their shared labor of love for nearly 3 decades. "We have built something extraordinary," Graham corrected, "and the best part is that we built it together." They sat in comfortable silence, the kind that comes from years of knowing each other so well that words become unnecessary. The stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. The desert that had once seemed harsh and unforgiving had become home, a place where their love had taken root and flourished against all odds. Graham Ryder, the cowboy who had followed the sound of a scream and changed 2 lives forever, pulled his wife closer and thanked whatever providence had put him in El Dorado Canyon on that fateful day in 1882. The debt had been paid, the struggles overcome, and what remained was this, a love story written in the dust and sun of the Nevada desert, a testament to the power of choosing courage over convenience and partnership over isolation. As they finally made their way inside to bed, walking hand in hand as they had for 28 years, Graham knew with absolute certainty that he would make the same choice 1,000 times over. Every hardship, every sacrifice, every moment of doubt had led to this life of fulfillment and joy. And tomorrow, they would wake up and continue building their legacy together, just as they had done every day since he had looked into the eyes of a desperate young woman and declared that she would be leaving with him. The story of Graham and Olivia Ryder became one of those tales that gets passed down through generations. A reminder that sometimes the greatest loves begin not with love at first sight, but with a choice to do the right thing and the courage to see that choice through to its conclusion. Their ranch still stands today, run by their descendants, a living monument to what two people can accomplish when they face the world together with determination, respect, and abiding love.